for us to stand with her. That we at SC really want to amplify women leadership, amplify women with incarcerated loved ones as leaders. And I think that what Coretta Scott King said, that if this nation is to be changed, that we as women, because of the unique way that we lead, the unique way that we collectively bring everyone together, that I think that is the way that we can revolutionize this country. And now I'm going to welcome Chandra, who's going to sort of open us up this morning with some words.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone feeling?
Marvelous.
Marvelous. I thought I would start. I love, anyone like children's books? Yeah, I'm a big fan of children's books. You all familiar with that nursery rhyme, rather, about the three little pigs? Well, back in the 80s, another version came out, and it was told from the wolf's perspective. You all heard that? And it's called The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. And I love this because the wolf says he was baking a cake for his granny's birthday party, and he needed to borrow a cup of sugar. He says, I'm just trying to be a democratic wolf, just thought I'd go and ask my neighbor if I could borrow a cup of sugar. So the wolf says he goes to the first pig, his next door neighbor, and you all know the story. The first pig's house was made out of straw. He thought to himself, this pig must be kind of weird. This isn't sturdy. Now the wolf said he happened to have allergies, really bad allergies. And I guess the weather must have been seasonal, just like this, kind of rainy out. So the wolf says when he gets there, his allergies started acting up and he sneezes a great sneeze. And he says the house falls down, and lying there is a dead pig. Now, clearly the wolf was not vegetarian, because the wolf said to himself, no need to let a good ham dinner go to waste. So he ate the pig. Then he goes to the second house, which is built out of sticks. Again, he said his allergies are acting up. So all of a sudden he sneezes a great sneeze, and that house falls down, and he's like, wow, the second pig was dead. So he thought to himself, let me put that one in the freezer for later. Then he goes to the third house, and we all know that third house is built out of bricks. Goes to the door, knocks on the door. He asks the pig, may I borrow a cup of sugar for my granny's birthday cake? And he says he was surprised because the pig got an attitude with him. And he said, normally I'm a very calm fellow, but when you start talking about my granny, I get agitated. And so the wolf says he sneezes, and they're arguing, and all of a sudden it creates a commotion. And out of nowhere, the cops come. The cops come and then arrest the wolf. Now the story gets out, and he says, rather than taking the truth of the story, which was that he was just trying to bake a cake for his granny's birthday party, he said the journalists thought that was too boring, way too boring. So he said they jazzed up the story and called him the big bad wolf. And they came up with all of this huff and puff and blow your house down. He said they created this entire narrative. But the truth of the story is, he says, I was framed. And you go to the very last page of this children's book, and you see that the wolf is actually behind bars. And he says, I'm still trying to borrow that cup of sugar. And I like to use that book, particularly as we spent these last 4 days in some very rich dialogue, testimony, sharing, and actually live realities and experiences to talk about all the ways the labeling happens, how we feel labeled, how we get stigmatized, who's what, who's presupposing things, who's imposing kind of labels on ourselves, what are the kind of shackles we carry, and then who's the pig and who's the wolf. And to point out how we tell these stories matter. And I think that's come across over and over throughout these last 4 days, and what's so powerful about the work that we're committed to doing here is that we've got to reclaim the essence of and the power of narrative and how we share what we live through. And then at the very same time, the healing work of debunking all of that kind of labeling, all of that stigmatizing rhetoric. And so I thought I would start with that, but also use a Martin Luther King quote, since it is King Day. And I'm one of these people who I like to find more obscure quotes of King, since folks always go to the mountaintop. And we are in the mountains, which is lovely. But I want to use the one you're all going to recognize. We all recognize the bottom. But King says this, and he says this in a lot of his sermons. But this particular quote struck me because it talks about how we're all interrelated. He says it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We all see that on advertisements. But this is the part I like. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for the sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's handed to you from the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea. That's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you depended on more than half of the world. This is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. And I like that because it brings together all the variety, the multiplicity of perspectives we bring. And so I simply offer a blessing in the spirit of Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, but all the other freedom fighters whose names we'll never know, and all the spirits, all those who, in so many different ways, brought us to this place. That may we all go forth from this day, reflecting on the shared beauty, community, the love, the resilience, the triumph of the human spirit, and take that with us in our days and weeks ahead to keep ourselves grounded, to keep ourselves rooted, and to keep ourselves inspired, particularly in those low moments. May this be like a Tupperware of sorts, that you can just spiritually reach in, take off the lid, and allow it to feed your soul when you're feeling low. So in that essence, peace and blessings. Woo!
So we're going to have to speak from our diagram, which I think I'm getting pretty good at. So now I want to bring up our SE kids, led by Alicia. And I know I shouted her out yesterday, but I just want to sort of lift her up a little bit more. When we started, before the summit, we had a retreat for SE. And Alicia began by talking to us about sort of what she was going to be doing with the children. And what struck me was her words about mindfulness and really going that step further beyond just having kids in a group and keeping them busy while parents are doing something important. To me, she conveyed that what she was going to be doing with the kids was going to be just as important as the work that we were going to be doing in this space. And so I'm really excited to see the outgrowth of what the kids have been doing, and they want to share a little something in tribute to Martin Luther King this morning. So I'm going to welcome Alicia and the children at this time.
Got it?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. The kids of Camp Essie have been working very hard on this presentation, and we're very happy to honor Dr. King today with some music and dancing. So can we give these kids a hand? All right. Maestro, please, first off. breathe for love.
I breathe for love.
I breathe for healing.
I breathe for healing.
I breathe for justice.
I breathe for justice.
Just breathe. Yes.
So as we get started in setting up the projector for our panel this morning, I want to just bring up now the owner of this wonderful space, Scott Myers-Lipton, who's here with us this morning. This is the co-owner with his lovely wife.
Yes.
And not only that, because it's Myers-Lipton, I get asked that a lot, and you can't start a relationship without having equality. So we're Myers-Lipton, and the other reality is that she's 51%.
Oh, right.
So I'm a sociology professor at San Jose State, and I ask my students always 3 questions as part of the class to kind of end it, to begin and end. It's like, where are you? Where have you been? And you have to know those to know where you're going. So I can't deal with all those questions except one, where are you? So I'm going to talk about where are you? And you're going to answer hopefully where we're going. Where are you? You're at the Sequoia Retreat Center. And this space and place is dedicated to social transformation. We had this crazy idea 10 years ago when I can remember I was sitting at my desk doing work, and Diane came in and said, the Sequoia Seminar, it was known, is up for sale. And she was looking for a job change. And she says, let's buy it. And we had never owned it was not on our to-do list to own a retreat center. For sure. We knew nothing about that. But we were clueless. But I had been a fellow at the Beyond War National Foundation, which owned this property for 50 years. And it was dedicated to peace. And just so you know, like, and we believe this, just like the trees are healing, we believe those trees heal you and us as we're here. This space has been a place of healing. Historically, for 50, 60 years of Israelis and Palestinians, civil society folks, not the civil society folks, coming here before folks were talking in the 80s talk. Armenians and Azerbaijanis, civil society, you know anything about that long conflict here. So this has a long history of peace and justice. So we said, well, we're progressive folks. Our team needs a space and a place to do the work, to come to the mountaintop, to re-energize ourselves and go back into the valley and do the work that we all know that's necessary on a day like this, right? A day like King Day. Because and our work is really, I don't know about you all, but I'm a Kingian. That's how I plant myself in the ground, as a Kingian. Someone whose work is dedicated to the end of racism, end of classism, and all the variety of types that how those integrate and intersect in each other, and then of militarism. And of militarism. Right? So those are what this place is dedicated, and we just want to say, we bought the place for you. This is who we bought it for you and the groups, the hundreds of groups that come through here, re-energize and do the good work. And it really couldn't be done. Like I'm talking, she wants to see you talk. You should say, you want to say any words?
They have good work to be done, so I think we should wrap it up.
Oh, let's wrap it up. So this is now, shut them up. Anyone, we want you to come back. We hope Essie comes back, and you can come to do retreats here. That's what we do. The business runs all year, and we do retreats pretty much all year, except how the place actually pays for itself is weddings. We do weddings from April to October. That's how the place actually is. Retreats are kind of break even, but those actually pay for all the things that we do here. So, you know, so
Anybody getting married?
But retreats, that's and you come back. So welcome. Continue the good work. We remember you, Dr. King and
Thank
Greta,
you.
and we're going to create the beloved community together. Hopefully, bless you all. Cards with you. Yeah. You all want? I wish I would we get some more, babe.
Yeah, we'll leave them out on the right.
Yeah, we'll put them up there in front. Yeah, we'll put them up front.
And we'll have a video to set up to next time.
Awesome.
So yesterday I realized that I didn't really get a chance to introduce the video that you saw. The My Feminism Is campaign is a direct result of the listening tour that I mentioned yesterday that I spent a year on. And as a result, I decided I wanted to make sure that we created an exclusive conversation that was going on around creating a more just and fair world. And so we created 5 videos that are a discussion around My Feminism Is. Yesterday you saw the introductory video. This one is a conversation between 2 men of color having a conversation on how hard it is sometimes to live in the space with the intention by which you want to do that, which for them is around feminism and how they continue to learn. If you are interested in learning more about it, the website for the Ms. Foundation is For Women, and that is also where you can get these lovely stickers and where you can get the t-shirts. So people had asked about that, and that's where you can go. And the last thing I will say is, if you are in Brooklyn, visiting or stopping by, please do not hesitate to reach out. We have space where people can work, and I love to eat, so there's always time for me to join you for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Any of those or all of those work for me. But this conversation, I think, is one of, there's one between Gloria Steinem and I on her journey on the road and my listening tour component, and how at this moment in time is when you're supposed to be doing what you're doing. And I believe at this moment in time is when I'm supposed to be leading the Ms. Foundation for Women, just like it's when I'm supposed to be here with all of you. So this is a brilliant conversation because it shows the complexities and yet the simpleness of the world in which suppression builds itself and how we try to change it. So.
How do you balance that? I find it very hard to turn off my brain, like my critical analysis of everything that I'm consuming, and so it makes it difficult to sort of enjoy some things. I can't listen to music, I can't watch TV. without it being like something, you know? Like before it was just like black, like it was just sad about everything.
But so hip-hop was cool, yeah.
Right? And then like you open up and it's like, oh, there's sexism, oh, there's homophobia, and there's transphobia, and all of these different things. You're recognizing the limitations of your cultural influences. We can't deny ourselves joy, right? Like I think any movement that's going to deny people joy is not one that's worth joining. But also we have to be critical about how we're deriving that joy. For you, like coming out of the sports world, like how has that affected your relationship?
I can't talk to any of my football friends about feminism, sexism, patriarchy, because they're like, come on, man, just chill out. In spaces and conversations with all men, right? The conversations are so loaded with sexism. I mean, like, it's impossible. Sexism is probably the first form of oppression that you learn, because you learn it in the home. You see your mother and father engage, and you see a certain hierarchy that just happens. You typically have to go outside of the home to experience racism. That was something that I was like, damn, like, I didn't realize that I've been sexist since I was 3. You know what I mean? You know, I think it's trying to separate the fact that football is a game, but people bring their sexist ways to this actual game itself. And I know that's still not clean, but football isn't something that I could honestly ever give up, because it's like breathing.
We start to understand racism at some point in our life with the interrogation of sexism. Even though it's the first thing that you're learning,
much later.
If it happens at all for some people, right? Like, if it happens at all, you really are beholden to a sort of a sexist operating system in terms of like a racial justice lens, right? So it's fascinating to think like, yes, that is the first thing that we do learn, and we carry that with us, and we don't ever have to ask a question about it because we are an oppressed group ourselves. It's easy to see who is on your neck. It's harder to recognize whose neck your boot is on, and we don't ever consider that.
You typically learn about slavery through the male lens, like how hard it was for black men, right? And I remember reading my first Bell Hooks book, Margin to Center, when she like really highlighted what women had to go through, that women got beat and had to work in the field and were raped. You know, and had to have a baby, and had to have that baby on their back while they're actually doing it. And for me, I was like, damn, like, how do I keep missing all of these things?
Well, because when we're talking about this oppression, like we're talking about like the rape of black women during slavery, it's still seen through the effect that it has on men.
What was the most powerful book that you read as far as like understanding of feminism?
Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde. Those essays just blew my mind. That really was the understanding of what intersectional means, right? Like I think having heard the word before that was like, oh yes, we have to identify all of these people.
It's a nice word.
Right, but Audre Lorde was like, oh no, this is what it actually looks like.
Do you think that your mother would identify as a feminist? Because mine would not.
No.
Anything that's interested
She would not. See, my mother is like the kind of the prototypical strong black woman, like you would think would qualify her for feminist.
She's probably real.
But they're like very traditional in terms of her understanding of just sort of men and women dynamics.
One day I asked my mom, I was like, can you imagine God as a woman? Because my mom is hyper-religious. And she was like, hell no. Is God loving? She was like, yes. I said, is God compassionate? She was like, yes. I said, is God sensitive? She said, yes. I said, that doesn't sound like a woman. But even that, I'm trying to be like this really beautiful feminist and all these things. I can still be just as sexist as anyone else. I think it's fascinating, man. Yeah.
Wow. So that was, oh my God. Is there more of this?
This is on the website, and it's also on our Facebook page, and you can share them and host conversations. They're supposed to start the conversation. The reality in the conversation that sometimes conversation points around feminism are limited to the echelon of white privileged women was what we were trying to get away from here, and the complexity by which the sexism is entrenched in our lives, and we don't even know it sometimes. For me, at the Manhood Foundation, we're about changing the narrative. and helping to ask ourselves the questions. And so this video is available online. There are two other videos, one by the sisters at Feministing, having a coffee table conversation about gender dynamics in an office. We're in the process of outlining potentially 4 or 5 more. One will be, which will be my most favorite one, I know. It would be also one with just Gloria talking about feminism, but the other one will be Marsha Gillespie, who was the former editor of Ebony Magazine and the former editor of Ms. Magazine, talking about feminism from her intergenerational position of having lived through the experience. And she very brilliantly says in the first video that you saw yesterday, she's the woman who says, feminism is my religion. And so we're going to expand that conversation also. So yeah, they're all up there. Feel free to download them and share them. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to outreach to me directly, and we can talk about it more. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that's a perfect welcome for our panel. I'm going to invite the panelists and our moderator to come up, our facilitator. Yes. So as they're getting settled, yeah, facilitator. Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm going to introduce our facilitator this morning, Cheryl Dorsey. Yes. Show her some love. Cheryl is the CEO of the Echoing Green Foundation, and she was also an Echoing Green Fellow back in 1992. She had a project called the Family Van, which was a community-based mobile health unit way back in 1992 in Boston.
Okay, don't hate me.
I say way back because I know quite a few Echoing Green Fellows. Gina Clayton obviously is one. They funded SE Justice Group. But just in terms of the innovative, dynamic projects that Echoing Green funds, I think if we all think about some of the most cutting edge projects that we see in our communities, Echoing Green really is spearheading that. And so I say you were one of the first because I think you really started your project and then ushered in that organization as president. So kudos to Ms. Dorsey for that leadership. And she's going to be moderating our panel this morning, Defining Manhood in the Movement. So I'm going to turn it over to her at this time. Thank you.
And can I just get, are we still, we've got to end at 11, is that right? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if we need to go a little bit over, that's fine. There are a few folks who may need to step out for flights, and apologies in advance to the panelists about this.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks for the time check. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Great. It's wonderful to see everybody again. My name is Cheryl. I want to start by thanking everyone here. Gina, thank you for holding this space, for convening this space, for your glorious leadership. Lily, her entire team, you guys are building something really extraordinary. Karen, thank you for your board leadership. And thank you to this group of accomplished, extraordinary women leaders. I appreciate being invited into this space, and I've learned a tremendous amount from each and every one of you. And I will take so much back with me. So thank you for allowing me to be here with you this weekend. You're just an extraordinary community of leaders. So thank you. Want to give thanks to being here on MLK Day. It's a particularly special day, I think, to bring together this conversation. And what a conversation it will be. You know, the old adage is you should never follow children, especially cute children on stage. But you not only have to do that, you have got to follow this amazing group of women leaders. But I have no doubt that this group of talented young men are all up to the task. So we will jump in. Let me quickly do their intros. Their bios are pretty amazing, but we don't want to lose time on the conversation, so let me just give their names and their titles, and then we will dig right in. Sitting directly next to me is Mark Anthony Johnson. Mark Anthony is the Director of Health and Wellness at Dignity and Power Now. To his left, we have Scott Roberts, Senior Campaign Director of Criminal Justice at Color of Change. Next to Scott, we have Jayadev. Did I get the last name? Thanks. Thanks, Rod. Who's the founder and director of Silicon Valley Debug. Next to Raj, we have Mark Philpart, who is director of Boy and Men of Color Initiative out of Policy Link. Mark. And then last but certainly not least, we have Cedric Brown, who is a managing partner at the K4 Center for Social Impact. Got an extraordinary group of male leaders. Can we give them a hand? Just prior to the panel, I asked Raj, Mark Anthony, and Mark, because they've been with us for the past couple of days, to maybe share some of the key learnings, insights that they have gleaned from you all in this conversation to bring our new panelists, Cedric and Scott, into the conversation and help set the table for what's to come. So, gentlemen, would you jump in and bring them up to speed?
Sure. So I would say the first highlight is one that you guys have all caught. And the young people, I mean, just was amazing just to have that kind of energy in here. That was phenomenal for me. Beyond that, though, the one thing that I've walked away with that I feel is just incredibly powerful is just, oh, can you hear me? Okay. The unearthing of so many hidden stories and narratives as part of this common struggle that we're all a part of when we talk about the justice system and how it's been ripping our communities apart. So often, at least in our work, focused on boys and men of color, we really centered our stories on the people who are directly impacted, the individuals who are behind bars, and haven't really evolved our narratives to be as inclusive as what we've heard today and throughout the last few days. And that's really been a powerful reminder for me about how expansive we need to be thinking and how inclusive we need to be in our approach to this work. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I think is this here? Okay.
Make sure it's on.
Is it? Says it's on.
Just turn it on.
Click it on.
It's clicked.
Yeah.
Okay.
No?
Turn it off.
Just project and we'll work on it.
Okay. I have a little soft voice, so maybe like the technology was like, you don't exist. There's something really poetic about being here, learning about the power of voice. So, I mean, the major gleanings, I probably would say read the book of what's going to come out of this weekend as like this historic gathering that turned an elbow of time in this country. I mean, I think really this gathering is that significant, and I say it's something that just feels that I had the honor to bear witness to something extremely powerful in the face of something extremely disastrous and awful. So, so check out the videos, I guess, of the other panels. The other, I guess, just simple way I could kind of summarize or synthesize what I felt in the last day and a half. Look, I came here after getting a text from a friend whose son got sentenced maybe 40 minutes away from here, Oakland. Is that 40? Her son got sentenced to 27 years. And it was a situation where the family fought as hard as they could, the community fought as hard as they could, the defense attorney fought as hard as they could. I got one text about the sentence, and then I got another text hours later about, okay, when are we meeting again to see what to do next? That's that sort of strength, and I think the word used here was resilience, that feels emanating out of here. And I'm so excited to be able to tell her, look, you have backup. I saw it. So, the last thing I say is if folks, look at that picture, there's a 1 in 4. And the number's striking because the 1 looks so lonely. And 1 is such a solitary number. But what the imagery doesn't really show you is all the people that are with her, as the campaign says. So that was a sort of striking gleaning from this week, is the isolated pain and how it can be transformed through the collective power.
Good morning, y'all. How are you? So I feel really grateful to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of this weekend. Really humbled. So I think there's two things that stand out for me about what's come up. Obviously, the stories I think have been the most humbling. But connected to that, I think on the panel yesterday, the idea around the research, the idea that 1 in 4 women are impacted by incarceration, have a loved one who's incarcerated, and how that statistic alone might be an understatement, right? I think it's something that really strikes me, specifically because that statistic is only looking at currently in prison, right? And as part of an organization that is trying to stop the construction of a women's jail, right? I'm looking at Los Angeles jails and looking at how the intensification of incarcerating women is growing and growing, and how the role we have to play in LA is pretty significant given that statistic. So I'm holding that really dearly and thinking about our folks at home as we do that. I think the other piece is the conversation we had around capitalism. I think is really important. I think making the connection between patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, I feel like is something I feel is really critically important. It brings up for me just thinking about my great-grandmother, Emily Frazier, who was born into slavery, had 12 children at a time where black women's bodies were owned by slave masters, and in a state where black women, if they gave birth to 20 children, could exchange that for supposed freedom, right? And I think so that the articulation and the intersection of that, for me, is really clear in terms of how women's bodies, black women's bodies in particular, were owned, and by a system that really sought profit off of our bodies, right? And so I really appreciate the way all those connections are being made, and feel really humbled about how to bring that home.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing Cedric and Scott up to speed, and I think we'll dive in. You know, the word I kept using over and over this weekend was brilliance. It was just this bounty of brilliance. Every panel, every conversation constructed. And I want to just adopt something that Sophia did yesterday with the first panel of other extraordinary, amazing women. And I loved how she had each of the panelists share their stories of their younger selves to explore their feminist journeys. It was beautiful and perfect. And I thought I would just sort of, they say, you know, a flattery, plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery. So I'm just adapting it, adopting it, co-opting it. I thought it was a beautiful way to enter the conversation. So let's flip it a little bit. And I would love to ask each of you, so what was your first impression or thinking or construction around manhood and masculinity? How did you start to frame it? Cedric, can we start with you?
Sure. I guess I want to also start by saying thank you. When the brilliant Gina Clayton contacted me about being on this panel, I was so honored and humbled. So I appreciate this as an opportunity. And to the degree that these 3 summaries that the gentleman gave get me up to speed, I actually feel like I'm further behind now. Like I have more work to do, and you know, I feel like I'm pretty smart. But I feel like I have so much more work to do around learning about the nuances of gender justice and how to be in the movement, etc. So to be quick about this, I've always known that I was a little bit different. And so my notions of what masculinity are and what manhood are were really informed by being a gay little boy. And really relating to girls and my mother and the women in the family, and struggling a lot with trying to butch up and not be a girly little boy, a little girly boy, or a little girl boy, as someone told me once. So I think that the ways that I've kind of constructed manhood in my mind, and also looked at my own journey toward trying to be a feminist ally, have certainly been informed by being a little bit different. I think that looking at, I want to flip this question, Mark and I were talking about this, I want to flip this question a little bit. I realized that I needed to align myself better and get rid of the sexism that is inherent, that the brothers in the video were talking about, that is inherent to anybody who's kind of living in this domestic context. When I thought I was this burgeoning track star, and this girl, 2 years younger than me, dusted me. And I said, oh. Okay, so, all right, then I'm not supposed to be better than girls at everything. And there are going to be girls who are smarter than me. And there are going to be girls who are stronger than me. And there are going to be girls who are X more than I am. And actually that's okay. And that's how it should be. And that was my first step in the discovery of what manhood could mean, being a responsible adult, and how to support and get rid of, how to support this gender justice pursuit and start to get rid of some of these notions that I've held and all of us learn about men needing to be this and women needing to be deferential. I'll stop right there.
Cedric, maybe we just sort of, you want to just sort of walk our way down, Mark, and the next?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think my earliest introduction to ideas about manhood began as a child, and they were primarily through the lens of dominance and fear. I would say mine was a household and a neighborhood that was very much focused on you know, control and you know, male masculinity being dominant as a way to you know, sort of I'm sorry, I'm just caught up here thinking about you know, the power of this conversation and as it relates to my life. You know, I had a strong mother. Let me just start there. I had a very strong mother, a strong matriarch, and I think most black folks do, right? But it doesn't stop the power of this idea of patriarchy from seeping into our family situations and our communities. And for me, you know, my mother's light was dimmed by my father. And his way of being a man was asserting himself over her. And whether that was verbal abuse or physical abuse. And the power of that just, you know, it haunts me. And beyond that, you know, even in the community, the community I grew up in Los Angeles, you know, being a man meant being feared. Being a man meant being able to take care of yourself in the streets. It meant not getting your shoes taken on the walk home. And not being punked. And so for me, I grew up with a very, very perverse form of masculinity and of manhood that I've been working to undo to this very day. My pastor always says, you know, in our spiritual walk that we're works in progress. And I think the same is true for our work around deconstructing patriarchy, fighting racism, and creating a more just society. And so my introduction to these issues really came at that young age. And for me, it wasn't until I was in college that I began to understand feminism in a more formal way. I went to a historically black college in New Orleans, Xavier University. And you know, I was a history major, and you know, history at a black college is black history. And so it was very powerful. It was a very powerful experience, very affirming experience. You know, one of my courses was Women in the Civil Rights Movement, and that was just eye-opening on a number of different levels. And then beyond that, I've just continued to build on those experiences and that understanding. And the work I do today focused on improving outcomes for men is really, for families and communities and for women at the end of the day. And so I like to see myself as an ally in this journey. I like to see myself as a feminist.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Raj?
Sure. I'm going to actually maybe start a little later in life, just because I was thinking of that intersection of movement and the power of feminism in the context of sexist realities. And if I hesitate using some of these words, I don't use these words that often, which maybe also speaks volumes. And so about 30 miles south of here, I was temping at an assembly plant, putting together laser jet printers. And for me, it was a temp job. I was figuring out my life. For the vast majority of people, that was their only way of existing in an expensive Silicon Valley. That was sublivable wages, no unions. You talk about kind of capitalism and how it impacts people's lives. Silicon Valley has invented a hyper-capitalism, which is changing the world. And so people were, getting $8 an hour and then shorted on checks. So anyways, it led to a lot of people being angry at the plant. And you're talking mainly about young people and immigrant communities. And the idea came up of trying to do something together, collective, to stop the wage issues that were going on. And some folks were talking at the break room, and just to put it in context of what I said earlier, male camaraderie can be very sexist almost by its makeup. Like how you actually bond with new men that you haven't met before is by being sexist. It comes with like a handshake almost in some circles. And so to not take that tone is to also isolate and ostracize yourself. And so anyway, so with that said, what happens on the assembly floors at 6 a.m. till 3 p.m. Outside of making of a product is, 8 hours of sexism. And so the idea was to come up with like a petition. That's what people were saying. Like, we'll make a petition, we'll make a petition. And I remember in my head being like, who's gonna sign this petition? Like, everyone's a temp worker. Like, there's no union. And you're going against HP, which is a lion in the largest economic political force known to man. And I remember the petition was sort of hand drafted, and this woman who was sort of like the matriarch of our conveyor belt line. So each conveyor belt had someone that was kind of leader. This woman, Dorothy, who is a black woman who also lived through the civil rights movement and marched, right? She went to her first because you had to clear it with the matriarch. You do anything. And she signed the petition, and I thought she was going to write manpower employee on it, because that was the extent of like what I thought people could do. And she wrote her name, her full name. And I remember asking her, I was like, why are you writing your name? And like, that's like putting a fire me on your forehead. And she looked at me kind of, like, watch your mouth, kind of like, but she said, I want them to know it's me. And that set the tone for not just the women in that plant, it set the tone for particularly not just the men, but the young men of color, who had a very different worldview of how you solve those economic problems. And it was about, I remember asking some of the young men that was on the other side of me, because we worked on the side that was mainly like young men. when they said, well, what are you going to do about these wage issues? What are you going to do about these health issues? What are you going to do about, what's going on with the bosses? They say, I'm just going to get out of here by myself. It was a solitary response versus what Dorothy was saying is you had to leverage the collective. And the reason why I bring it up is because I had romantic views of what a leader meant, but every one of those visions was of a man. But when I saw it actualized and what could be transformative, it wasn't to become Martin Luther King, it was to harness what I saw Dorothy do. And what was powerful was not just that she embodied a different pole in that place, is that her power transformed. That young man of color who said, I'm just gonna get out of here by myself, now felt emboldened to put his name, so that they would know his name too.
And we'll put a bookmark and sort of this gender roles and notes around leadership, because we will come back to that. Scott, thank you, Rob.
Yeah, well, I also, first of all, want to just share my appreciation for being here. I want to apologize for two things before, so it's not good to start with apologies, but I'll do it. I apologize for coming here looking like the man. I promise this is not who I am. This is not to say about you, but our executive director, Rashad Robinson, was supposed to be. If anybody here knows Rashad, he's a very suit and tie guy. He even wears a little hat. I won't do the hat, but when I sub for him, I feel like I have to come in and look like him. My bad. But some people here know me, so they'll tell you this is not Scott. But I also apologize just for only joining you all this morning. Obviously, this is an extremely important space, extremely important work that's being done, and Color Change, we want to be involved in this work. I feel like I know that I missed out on a lot of learning this weekend, so if you want to school me afterwards or anything like that, please, I'm definitely open to that. Who's that? Yes. Talk to her later. But very serious about that. But with that out of the way, I think for me, my kind of initial understandings about manhood, masculinity, I think it's interesting because you get influences from so many directions. What happens at home, what happens in the larger community, messages you get from media, school, things of that nature. For me, I grew up, I guess, with a lot of dissonance and feeling a lot of contradictions around questions of gender and gender roles. I was, I think, very fortunate to grow up in a house that didn't really stick to traditional gender roles. My father was like a bit of a hippie, so he, but also just, I don't know what it was, but he's different. And so I grew up with like, first my father doing most of the cooking in the house. My mother, which it's typical in a lot of black families, I think, but she always made more money. I never saw, like my father didn't run the house, maybe my mom did. And so that created dissonance with me. And then I grew up, I was born into kind of a movement family. I'm from a small town in Virginia, Emporia, Virginia. You might have heard of it? No, right. Was that a hand? All right, so my family was, for a few generations going back, very involved in civil rights struggle there. And so I grew up, in addition to, seeing the way that my parents related to each other, hearing the stories of those struggles, and they always had women at the center of them. My kind of favorite person is my father's mother, Christine Roberts, who was part of what they would call today a squad of young women who were leading leading civil rights locally herself. I'll say their names because I like to. Another aunt of mine, Rose Allen, a friend of theirs, Effie Revis. They were really the core of the civil rights struggle locally. Maybe for like half a century.
till recently when they've have passed on. But I always heard those stories at the center of the movement work. I was, real respecting them. My favorite stories about my grandmother helping black men cheat on the literacy tests growing up. So, I saw and understood women's ability to lead more from just observing. And, but there was a dissonance. I was also at the same time raised heavily churched, as they say. I was raised in a, black Pentecostal church where women weren't allowed to be ministers. They couldn't wear pants, which was always the weirdest part to me. And I just felt, I constantly felt the dissonance. And then the other pieces, with some of the other brothers I've alluded to around, male culture. So whether in school or in the street, being, taught masculinity equal dominance, violence, things of that nature. So I guess, I didn't, I grew up kind of with some imperfect feminist sensibilities. I think I understood what affected me most, I think, in the male culture it didn't affect my views on women because I think I was more impacted by the women in my family and their roles, but it actually impacted the way that I looked at men, more so than anything. I think I was, extremely homophobic, both from the church culture and, like neighborhood culture. The worst thing to me was like to be for lack of a better word, a punk, that you didn't want to be that. Feeling like you needed to be tough. So, there was that dissonance. And then I also went to historically black college, an all-male one, Morehouse. That was almost like a setback in some ways. I love Morehouse. And I don't want to talk bad about Morehouse on King Day. So I had to work, it's a fantastic institution, but, it was an all-male school, and then, there's a lot of issues around masculinity there, but definitely there were no classes on feminism or anything like that.
Go across the street, right?
No doubt. The Spelman sisters will get you right. So they were a good check on you, for sure. But I didn't really get to a point where I identified as a feminist until I went to graduate school. And speaking of people getting your mind right, I had opportunity to study with Kathy Cohen and Melissa Harris Perry in graduate school. And yeah, there was a lot of taking me out to the woodshed, explaining to me what I said in class wasn't cool, and I appreciated that. I always appreciated that. But at the end of the day, for me, I always, when I think about the role that I want to play in the movement, this is the last thing I'll say. I don't take time, but I actually have an uncle just passed away last January, Eugene Roberts. He was kind of my model for the work in that. He was extremely active local political actor. In the 80s and 90s, we had a project going where we basically were trying to elect a countywide black official for the first time in my hometown, which is majority black, but had always been controlled by a white power structure. The role that I saw him playing on those campaigns, which we typically ran women for those roles, he always played the background. He was an advisor. He got out on the streets. He was the guy who went door to door with them, knocking doors, and it just showed me like a different model of men interacting with women in campaign and movement spaces. So want to also show him some love on this kind. But yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Scott. Mark Anthony.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely relate to a lot of the messages that folks are naming already. This conversation is making me thinking about intergenerational messaging, intergenerational socializing around patriarchy, right? So my dad, I would consider him to be that kind of benevolent patriarch, right? A sensitive father, but who was still socialized as a man and still enacts those power roles in some ways, right? My mom, very much a strong woman, doesn't take any mess, was a primary disciplinarian in my household, that type of thing. But both of them have a way of challenge in terms of accessing their own feelings, accessing their own emotive space, and I used to trip out on that because that's the same struggle I have, right? And I used to blame them for that, but when I think about their fathers, right, both of them came from traumatic households, right? Both of them came from my father. The joke amongst my uncles is that the only reason he has a head today is because he ducked, right? He came from an alcoholic father, rageaholic father, whose way of dealing with his own powerless in the world was rage and violence, right? And my dad took that on and went to try to be the exact opposite, but I think that impacted the way he accessed emotion, right? My mom the same way. She came from a very disciplinary household. Father was a Navy SEAL, and so you can imagine the type of socialization that he very much held down in the house. And her mom, who ran away from home at the age of 17 to escape sexual violence, and her coping mechanism was very much not accessing feeling, right? And so all of us, from great grandparents, parents down, are impacted by this inability to access feeling, inability to access empathy. My mom very much told me from the beginning, yeah, like always fight for those that feel powerless or that you see are experiencing violence, but at the same time was telling me not to cry, right? At the same time telling me, don't, wipe those tears up. Don't let nobody, don't show anybody that, right? And so there's a tremendous mixed messaging that happened for me, and dissonance, as you said, specifically later in life when we're starting to talk about emotional labor. Like, what are you talking about emotional labor? Like, what does that even mean in that context? It wasn't until my first introductions to feminism as a word wasn't until high school, and I think I was fortunate to be a part of a program, social justice school, where we actually had a unit where we explored feminism, and we explored racism, we explored capitalism. And just by the nature of having a group of women around me who, because they were queer women of color, were black belt feminists, you know what I'm saying? And kicked my butt all day, every day, you know what I'm saying? And I think that was necessary, and it's still kicking my butt today, which I think, history warrants that, and I think that's really important. And it wasn't until later, much until I got into organizing, where even that understanding had to be refined, and thinking about patriarchy and thinking about the limitations of sexism as a white middle-class woman framework, and who was Bell Hooks, who was Alice Walker, who was all those things that I didn't have an understanding of, and I think that it's been a long journey. It's been a very long journey. It's a journey in progress, and I think, as one of my favorite friends back home at DPN calls himself a recovering sexist, right? And I would definitely treat patriarchy as I would any act of sobriety, right? It's impulsive, it's compulsive, it gets worse over time, and it destroys families, right? And I definitely feel like if we're going to make it, I think we, particularly as black men, have to be in consistent conversation and consistent work with each other around that piece. That's what stands out to me.
Thank you. That was an incredible conversation, so thank you for sharing that with us. And I think we already all know the answer to this question, and Mark Anthony, you were just sort of talking about this sort of role of patriarchy impacting all of us, and wanted to know if anyone else on the panel wanted to talk about how your voices may have been silenced by patriarchy. And a couple of you touched on it, but wanted to make sure we tease that out a little bit before moving ahead with the conversation.
Yeah, I would say that it has definitely sort of limited, me in a number of ways. One, similar to Mark Anthony, it's kind of dimmed my emotional intelligence, the ability to feel and interact in a deep and empathic way. And when you do that, it's easier than other people, right? It's easier for you to imitate the intimate sort of violence and structural violence that you're taught. And so I think, that has definitely been a limiting factor. And then, it also hinders you from seeing the different shades of masculinity, right? You grow up with this one ideal of what it means to be a man, and that's just, it's false. And so, it's been a really enlightening journey for me to be able to, you know, pull back the covers, if you will, and explore, you know, feelings, connections, and ways of understanding the world with a new set of eyes.
Anybody else want to comment before we wrap up?
I mean, just one quick thing. This may be about the leadership piece, but it was brought up yesterday of this notion of this sort of romantic fantasy of the individual leader, the individual iconic male leader, and I think what rarely gets acknowledged, I think, for men is how seductive that is. Like, and how it's just like being in a river that has a current. And if you don't, like Mark Anthony was saying, unless there's a really recognized vigilance against it, it will take you. We rarely even have like language. Even the language is part of the current, you know. So just something, you know, so all to say that I think sometimes there's injury in patriarchy that feels good to people.
I guess I just want to highlight something that was said in the video, and I think has been said in other ways here on the panel about not being able to enter into spaces, into kind of all male spaces, and have a conversation where you start to address sexism, the sexism that's happening, and to really get folks to realize how deeply ingrained it is, even in the language that is used for epithets. I mean, look at how many of them point to equating weakness with being like a woman or being submissive. And there are a lot of dudes who don't get that at all. And to try to have that conversation can be super difficult. And I guess I just want to put that out there because that's part of the work that needs to happen as men are working in support of gender justice. Lastly, I really like this. I don't know what the agreed upon definition of gender justice is, but the one that I'm putting together for my purposes, I like it because it's more expansive and it doesn't have the same kind of baggage that feminism does. You can't be, I was actually told that I could not be a feminist. I could be a feminist ally, but I couldn't be a feminist. So I was like, well, okay. Just keep trying to do the work regardless. But gender justice. My husband told me that. But anyway. But gender justice, I think, creates room for all of us to do the work that needs to happen underneath that bigger umbrella in pursuit of this larger ideal. This is really lastly. Lastly, I didn't say how I came into this. The K4 Center, the K4 Foundation, as we were known as at one point, has also been doing this Men, Boys of Color work. And I personally wanted to be involved in that because I didn't want to perpetuate these old notions of patriarchy and kings, and we got to lead, and we got to... No. I did not want that to be woven into and institutionalized in the ways that organizations are working to create opportunities for men and boys of color, and wanted to strike a balance. And I think that Mark might agree with me that I've been really pleasantly surprised that in many cases that has not been the issue. So, yeah.
And, you know, thank you for sharing that, Cedric. When we were talking about sort of terminology and gender justice, I wanted to give a shout out to an incredible social innovator that Echo and Green invested in a couple of years ago, B. Cole, who started the Brown Boy Project. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Cole's work, is really creating this incredible community of masculine, of center women. And men and two-spirit people, trans men and allies, all committed to really changing the way that communities of color talk about gender, really creating healthy frameworks of masculinity.
I'm a brown boy.
Love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. You want to share anything else, Mark? But I just think
no,
we're talking
you
about
hit it. You hit it
right there. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So let's sort of move to discussion around leadership. You know, Gina and I were talking last night. Here we are on Dr. King's Day, talking his story as opposed to her story, gender roles around leadership. Would you all sort of talk about that? And again, you started sort of going down that role. How do you think about your roles as leaders, and then more broadly, men in the struggle versus women in the struggle, and how do we intersect, and where is the tension, and where are the commonalities? Scott, I don't know if you want to start. You mentioned your uncle.
Yeah. Well, I think, like I said, for me, and I mean, there's a, you know, you give the history would take all day, but I don't think that what I described in terms of what the patterns have been in my community, both from, you know, my grandparents' generation, also in my parents' generation, I said you know, usually at the core of movement activity are women. Like that's, I think, pretty much everywhere. And you know, when you do the history around the civil rights movement, though we, like on today, celebrate these male icons, you know, you find the same things. And I think one of the things for me that's interesting right now is we're in this kind of Black Lives Matter moment. That there, you know, some of that is being lifted up in better ways, women's leadership. I wonder though if sometimes we just try to replace the man with the woman, you know? And I, reading this kind of management article on management the other week, and talking about the difference between men and women and success in management, how difficult it is for women to get to management roles, but when they get there, they perform so much better. Right. And it just made me think about what it means to lead like a woman, which, you know, I don't want to over-essentialize, obviously, women's leadership styles, but, you know, for me, I try to think about that and try to learn from my personal experience has told me that I prefer to work for women and with them when they're in leadership roles, and I try to dig into what that's about. And I think some of it's the very reasons why you don't see women in a lot of times in these bombastic, iconic leadership roles, because they tend to make more space for other people. They tend to be reluctant to step into the spotlight. I've been like guilty of pushing women leaders into like that male leadership role because there was some male guy over here who was gonna dominate the spotlight and tell the story in his own way because there was a vacuum. I think that's some of the tension with thinking about leadership. But you know, again, I think the good thing is most of us have examples where we've been led by women, if nothing else, but at home. And I think the more we can help people connect to that understanding, the easier for folks to like make that transition, maybe. But it's, you know, like I said, it's really tough questions about like what it means to shift the leadership structure in our organizations and movements.
So in California, I participate along with a few folks in here, Andrew and others, in this network called the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And the operative word is for boys and men of color, not of boys and men of color. And so we have been very intentional about the role, about creating an inclusive space that allows both male and female leadership to work on the issues in partnership, right? And having a leaderful effort, not one that is dominated by one individual voice or entity. And so, you know, as you know, the person coordinating a lot of this work across the state, I've tried to lead from behind and uplift people who are too often not heard from, and oftentimes that has put me in a position to, you know, support female leadership, and to often you know, ensure that there are a diverse set of voices. But like Scott said, you know, you can often replace the person but not change the dynamic. And I think, you know, we have work to do in that regard. I think all of our advocacy efforts do. I think so many people are comfortable with the singular entity being the a male who's, coordinating this orchestra of activity. And that's just not true. I mean, our effort would collapse if not for female leadership. And so we have to do a lot of education with our partners, our advocacy targets, our people in government, in order to help change people's understanding of how we're doing this work in community, because oftentimes it's just not grasped or understood.
Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to think about what we do in our sort of circles in San Jose. And so yesterday on Sunday and then tomorrow on Tuesday, every Sunday, every Tuesday, families whose loved ones are facing charges meet either at Debug or at a church over in East San Jose. Some of y'all have been there. Gina's been there, and a number of people. And it's sort of this, it's mainly women. It's the 1 in 4 who are refusing to sort of let that number just sit. And it's not exclusively, but it's mainly women. And what is interesting is when folks are new to that meeting space, and it's the darkest, most anxiety-filled moment of people's lives, right? And whether it's the person facing the charge or the precipice of whether their families can be torn apart. So it's where it really matters. And in that anxiety, people will, when they sit at that circle, subconsciously look at me. Just because there's this training around, well, the man must be running the meetings. But some of y'all that have been to those spaces, those are women-led meetings. And it wasn't to be, it wasn't, that wasn't the end game. The end game wasn't create women-led circles. It was a process in order to, which is for us to be more effective, we needed to have leadership that understood the value instincts of collective action in a way that was just fluid and natural. So, the meetings are run mainly by mothers who fought for their own child and now are helping other families. And some of those things that came up over the week of like how folks can see power in others or help lift that up, that just came so fluidly. So, I guess what I'd say is this term gender justice, it's not gender justice as part of the process of ending mass incarceration. In my mind, in that very microscopic Sunday, Tuesday night, on a larger scale, is that I don't think there's a logic or the mathematics to end mass incarceration any other way. It just doesn't seem conceivable.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about structure and leadership in our organization. I think it's refreshing to be a part of BLMLA and a part of DCAM, where we're really grappling with and naming group-centered leadership, right? And moving explicitly away from the iconic, egotistical, central figure of a movement, right? I think that's absolutely critical, right? But then I struggle, at the same time, regardless of my history, regardless of my politics, regardless of all that, being in an organization which is mostly women of color, significantly queer. I probably am the only person in my organization that has never been incarcerated. And there are those moments where folks are looking at me, well, what do you think, right? And so I think the question of leadership, I think it's about redefining leadership and forcing folks to understand that, right? So for me, as a director of health and wellness, I take so much amazing wisdom from the folks who are literally experiencing PTSD while they're sitting in meetings with sheriffs pushing back on them, right? And then telling me, this is how we need to heal our folks when we get back to the office, right? But you don't see that work, right? You don't see that work on the TV camera. You don't see that work. The news is not going to show that, right? But that's leadership, right? To be able to take the impact someone has And I'm thinking about Jada Raspberry, who's our organizer. She is consistently thinking about not only her trauma, but is thinking about how the trauma of folks that's getting kicked up in the room, and is translating that, okay, how does that influence the infrastructure of our organization, right? And that, to me, that is a role that women have held down for so long, right? For so long. But it's not a leadership, quote, traditional patriarchal leadership quality that we see, and I think shifting that is really critical, right? Shifting that narrative, shifting who gets the credit for the longevity of our organizations, for the longevity of our struggles, I think is really critical. And so changing the narrative around leadership, I think is really critical. But yeah, I think it's something that I'm constantly navigating, right? You know, if it's specifically because there's so many moments where, yeah, we can prep for the press conference, we can prep the talking points, we can do all that, but if at the last moment you tell me I can't do this, I'm not gonna push you to go out there and do it, right? I'll encourage you, I'll tell you everything affirming I need to, but if all of a sudden something's getting kicked up, you know what I'm saying, because of who's in the room or the badges in the room, like, I just can't push you to do that, right? And that's a space, and for me, the implication of that is how we as men hold the emotional labor of that moment, right? On the trajectory of people's leadership, right? And I think we have to do that a lot more. So that to me is the grappling that I have, and that I'm excited about, but also is challenging moments in terms of leadership.
Cedric, you would add anything?
Just that using your kind of privilege or platform to help facilitate leadership and a more broadly defined way of leading, approach to leadership, I think is important. So, you know, people are looking at us in various times to lead for whatever reasons, then being able to redirect some of the attention to the people whose voices need to be heard and uplift that is, I think, is a necessary part of being a leader who is open to moving beyond the superstar leader archetype.
Well said. And are there particular sort of tools or resources that you all call upon as you are working with other leaders and leading from behind, as you said, Mark, sort of supporting others to come into their own as leaders that you'd like to share with the group?
I think it is, for me at least, it's just really being in tune to what people are experiencing and trying to not be about the work to where, we're so caught up on what we're trying to accomplish that we're not paying attention to how it's accomplished. And so taking a moment to pause and reflect and really think about who's stepping up when and how and what they need, as a unit to be better, I think has been important for me to be able to build in practices that allow me to, support leadership in a more authentic and collaborative way. And, I think being in deep relationship with people, that is something that we often take for granted. I think, we have to, the nonprofit industrial complex is, one of those, so often we just are, these are my coworkers, and you just kind of leave it at that. But, if we're really talking about movement building and we're really talking about the type of transformation that I think we all want, they're more than that, and we have to, recognize that humanity and really fellowship with people in a deep way to allow for the type of collaborative leadership that I think is really critical to our success.
And I agree with Mark saying that, and I think it plays out in the really small things that go unseen or unnoticed. So, and that's kind of what I meant about the vigilance. It's perceived as something that can be sacrificed in this broader urgency. So to put it in the backdrop of what we're talking about today, there's a language of how urgent this fight is, and if we're trying to stop someone from going to prison, this has to get done the most efficiently way as possible. But so some of these mannerisms that are central to us getting to a farther, more systemic change like rotating facilitators. I mean, that sounds very unsophisticated maybe, but it's a big deal. Like, so our meetings, there's a whiteboard on the back, on the wall. There's someone holding the pen, and people are saying the name of who they're fighting for, and we go through each name. That's what we have. But who's holding that pen is so important on so many levels. And so we rotate who's facilitating as a way to show that new person coming in, we're looking horizontally, not vertically. And it's those disciplines that I think is important. So they're not looking at whatever the conventions told them to look to as a navigator.
This isn't something that people don't know already, and I'm sure it's been said a number of different times throughout the course of this retreat and gathering, but getting grounded. So when you first asked the question, I thought, talking to my mama, which is actually the stand-in for a couple of things. It's gaining a perspective outside of the day-to-day grind. She lives in North Carolina, where she was born and where I was born and we were raised, and she's not kind of steeped in this Silicon Valley talk and whatnot. So being able to have a conversation with somebody who is not in the work about day-to-day stuff, what's important to you, what's happening with you, I think can give us a necessary perspective. And then the other part of it is just getting regrounded in what you know is real and right, and breathing, as our kids said to us earlier this morning, and really just having our feet planted in terra firma, and whatever way we have to get there, getting there.
Well said. I want to make sure folks have a chance to ask questions of you, provide commentary, and just have a back and forth. And we're short on time, but the organizing question, what does manhood mean to this work? What does it mean for this movement? Love any closing thoughts to share with the group before we open it up to questions and comments.
For us, and when I say us, I'm talking about the broader network that we're working within, the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color here in California. We have really wrestled with this question, and there's still more work to be done, but I think for us it means, sort of aiming our aspirations and our goals towards this gender justice ideal. We have to redefine manhood in order for us to be successful. And I think a lot of what we do is focused on, the straight up, policy outcomes that I think we are all concerned about: more jobs, less contact with the justice system, educational systems that actually work for our young people. But, I think in doing that, we also have to be about the radical healing that is the redefinition of manhood, because it's not going to be enough for us to just put people in jobs and put people in better educational systems and we think that things will be okay. We have to undo and transform. And I think for us, that quest is rooted in this effort to advance racial equity, deconstruct patriarchy, wrestle with economic injustice, so all of those things are tied up in one. And we often don't do ourselves justice because we don't separate key questions, that are a part of our work. For example, we often get stuck on who's hurt. We don't talk about who heals or who needs to heal. We don't talk about who benefits. And I think we have to ask many of those questions together as we're advancing our campaigns and doing work in coalition. There are so many policy issues that I think transcend the work and get at these really important intersections. I don't know if we'll have a chance to talk to them today, but I'm hoping that there might be a chance to discuss a few of them, because I think when we start to ask those questions about all of these different areas, we can start to tell a story that is just more complete and more reflective of who we are and who we want to be.
Yeah.
Mark Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of what is manhood in the movement, I think is a really important and exciting question. I think for me, thinking about patriarchy as a system, as a historical, economic, spiritual system of violence that benefits men, patriarchy does not have the imagination that it's going to take to make systemic change. Right? It doesn't, right? And I think where I draw that experience from is I had the chance to go to Venezuela. And it's at a time when Hugo Chavez was still alive, and we were talking about capitalism yesterday, and Venezuela is a socialist project. And it blew my mind to see that in Venezuela, pregnancy is considered a job that deserves a wage. Being a full-time mother is considered a job that deserves a wage. You can get a pension for those things. Like that blew my mother-loving mind. You know what I'm saying? I was like, this is crazy, because we're not talking about this in this way. Like, imagine the stress we would put on the system if we were making demands like that, right? That money would have to be divested from something, right? Hashtag prisons, hashtag jails, right? That's exciting. But as long as patriarchy and as long as masculinity, as long as the river that is making masculinity the recipient of liberation and the subject of liberation, we're not going to have the imagination to get to those types of demands, right? And I think part of the thing I'm thinking about in terms of state violence right now, I think we've done an excellent, amazing job thinking about BLM, thinking about so many other organizations right now that are talking about anti-black state violence. There's a lot of work about lifting up women who are experiencing anti-black state violence, which I think is so, so critical, right? And we're able to lift up the ways in which people are being shot and killed and beaten, all these really brutal and terrible things, right? And the second highest complaint against law enforcement is sexual violence. And that hasn't caught fire in the same way. You know what I'm saying? And we're talking about cisgender women. We're talking about attacks on black trans women. That has not caught fire in the same way. And if violence is the technology of patriarchy, we can't undo patriarchy by only taking on one expression of it. We got to deal with the whole spectrum, right? And so I'm posing that question to myself as a member of BLM, as a member of DPN, right? And thinking about how can we blow that up some more, right? How can we advance that imagination, that articulation of the full spectrum of violence? And really, when we start to look at that, then we have to pose some serious questions about what's our role as men in reproducing sexual violence as well, right? And that's getting to some of the more deeper work that we got to do. So I think it's an exciting question to be asking, but that, to me, the question around imagination, the question around how we're articulating the real conditions and the full spectrum of conditions right now in this moment, I think are really, really critical. And I think also the question of back to this piece around labor, right? Being a man in the movement to me means sharing the invisible labor, right? Like if there's an argument in the office, if there's a rupture amongst coalition partners, if someone's trauma is getting kicked up, that work cannot be left to the cisgendered women in the room. That work cannot be left to the transgendered women in the room. Like we have to be able to build the skill set to be able to hold those things, right? And so I think that's, to me, is part of the exciting conversation that we can have.
Cedric?
I just want to sit with that for a little bit because there was so much that you just shared there, but I'm going to make a comment anyway. I'm thinking about the long haul question that could be potentially threatening about how do we get to being post-gender, right? How do we move beyond the limitations of patriarchy, misogyny, etc. And I say it can be threatening because people don't want to give up roles, right? And the roles clarify things for us and help us to understand and categorize and whatnot, but how do we push beyond even that and then work backwards from there so that we can construct what it means to be, what humanhood means. Because I think manhood is less important than adulthood. How do we get people to be responsible adults, loving adults? How do we, and then that way you can encompass what it means to be a young woman, what it means to be a young man, what it means to become an adult. So I feel like that's moving toward this kind of post-gendered self. But then there are all of these other questions and pieces of work that have to be done in order to get there. So think about what Mark Anthony just said.
Yeah, I just want to. I wish I could just repeat what Mark said. Anthony said, but the thing that stood out to me is what I heard is as a movement, we can't win with patriarchy, right? Which is, you know, I think that's helpful for men, you know, because we're socialized around winning and getting it done and, you know, stuff like that. I think that's one of the things, you know, like the internal work that men in the movement have to do is obviously trying to shape that socialization under patriarchy. I know for me, you know, folks have been talking about healers. That was one of the things for me for years. I don't want to, no, get the healers away from me, no time for that. Like, you know, we don't have time for that. We have to win. And not realizing the value that I was bringing to the table. So I think that's crucial. And I think the other piece about why we have to shift the way we think about gender in the movement in order to win is the stories of the women in our communities are so powerful. And when we're not telling them, we're really giving away a lot. Yeah. You know, within our movements, not just within our movements, but within our communities and the impacts that these systems have on them, women are, you know, the protagonists in these stories most of the time. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds of like narrative and communication, but in storytelling, there's a lot of evidence that if you tell the story of victims, you know, this man was killed by the police, this you know, man is incarcerated unjustly. That people don't, it doesn't resonate with people. You're telling stories of the heroes, the protagonists, you know, of the mother, wife, aunt, daughter who is dealing with who's persevering through the challenges of having a family member that's incarcerated, or and how it's affected them can be so much more impactful. And I think that there's in telling the stories of women in our communities is hugely important for so many reasons, but mainly most of all because I think it's going to get us to where we need to be in terms of victory.
Thank you, Scott. Raj?
I think folks here said it all. Just that, you know, riffing off what Scott said, you know, people looked at these stories of incarceration as static, as there is a victim, there is a protagonist. But I think what, you know, this weekend's about, and I think what's possible in a very fluid moment where patriarchy can end, you know, not in some hypothetical sort of down the road academic term, but we're in a moment now where young men who had a conception of manhood, when you ask them who are they looking up to, they're talking about Alicia Garza. Mm-hmm. That's a whole new shift of cosmology that we need to sort of respond to. But it's also happening in those little circles. It's happening, you know, in households where those that have been described as the victim that needs saving actually are internally turning a switch of not accepting that role and becoming protagonists. And I think that's where the conversation of manhood as a framework is sort of maybe falling in the backdrop of what a collective movement for liberation could be. So I think it's an exciting time. And we got the youngsters like Nanji and other folks that are going to grow up in that time, in a world where they're not asked, you know, anyways. I know what the guys back home are going to ask me, you know, they're going to say, oh, was he good? Like, was he good at singing? When the women are going to say, did he like it? And just this notion, some of these very subtle things around competition and the larger purpose is just a pivot of perspective.
Right. Well said. I want to make sure we have a chance to commentary. Anyone want to add anything? Questions?
Yeah, thank you all. When you hear other people's personal stories, you kind of reflect on your own. And when I was listening to our first panel of the summit and the amazing women, our panelists who are up there, asking questions about what is patriarchy and what is feminism. And I grew up in a household that I think I would describe as probably most matriarchal and feminist as I've ever heard of, particularly for a family from India. My great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, they've all been the primary breadwinners. They were pioneers and groundbreakers in the work they did outside of the home. And all of that work was focused on empowering women. And inside of our home, they are the managers, the decision makers, and it's not just that they do these things, it's that we give them credit for that, and that's very explicit. But I think if someone were to ask me who are the strongest feminists in your life, I would say my father and my grandfather, who raised me. And I say that because they have very, I think, highly evolved political consciousness about enabling women to access political, social, economic opportunity, and they do that in the work they do and in how they raised me. And they didn't come out of the womb like that, right? They didn't learn that from Indian society. I think they were shaped and taught that by their wives. And now that I'm sort of in the real world and outside of this feminist utopia I grew up in, it's sort of, you know, disappointing sometimes because most men don't have that kind of evolved consciousness about feminism. And so my question is, partly I think what I've been wondering is what can we do to help bring young men along? But also, what do all of you do? For the few of you who work with young men or are raising young men, what do you explicitly do to help them think about women accessing those same opportunities?
Well, I mean, I could answer real quickly. I think it's really about points of reference of experience. Have you seen it, felt it? You know, Indian philosopher Krishnamurti said, you don't get wet talking about water, you have to feel it. And so young men that walk into Debug, which is a lot of, bless you, a lot of young men who are sculpted in a vision of manhood that was described earlier today. You have to be violent to survive. You have to dominate. But when they're coming to Debug, who they're seeing is Gail, a mom who fought for her son and is going to fight for them. Who they're seeing is Blanca. Who they're seeing is Ceci. Who they're seeing is Charisse. And so they're having a new point of reference in their lived experience of strong women that not only are strong in the peripheral, but we have young men who had ascribed to a notion of manhood that was about domination, and who actually saved them from incarceration. It was a woman. And so they have that now in their lives. So they're gonna grow up with a new conception of gender.
One response that I would offer too is that I believe in this post-gender vision that Cedric outlined. I think we have a long way to go before we can get there, but in the interim, I feel like it's important for groups like this, networks like this, to support other networks and groups that are working with men, because I feel like we have a responsibility to work with each other to address the things that we've all been talking about today. It's not enough for us to be on the stage, right, and to espouse these things in a safe place. I think we have to go into those uncomfortable conversations with other men and begin to break down some of these traditional beliefs that are so corrosive to the broader movement. And so I would, suggest that, one thing that we could all do is support men coming together and doing deep work like that.
I'd like to enter the conversation by saying, this is why I don't say the B word. Because that opens up a whole, it can, if someone's listening, that can open up a whole kind of range of points to make about how sexism is very present with us, how misogyny is very present with us, and that some young men just have never realized that, oh. So it becomes this kind of a moment of awakening. Now what they decide to do with it afterwards is largely up to them, but it's a point of entry that if I were to come and say, well, let's talk about feminism, they wouldn't get, because they're like, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me. But you have been saying the B word, so that's why that does happen.
We're going to make sure we get a couple other comments. Yes.
So I have a question. So my question is, how do we as a society decolonize from the system of patriarchy And I know we were talking about like conversations with like men, but what I see is something that you said earlier, which was even though there's change in leadership, there's still no change in the dynamic. This is something that I see a lot. I see that many times we as women are vehicles for that same, for sustaining the systems that oppress us ourselves, and patriarchy being one of those. Like for example, in my home growing up, there was a lot of double standards, you know, which I would say that in many, and I'm Mexican, so a lot of people are like, oh, Mexicans, you know, machismo and patriarchy is just like so, you know, dominant in your, you know, in your culture and things like that. But I would say that in my home, you know, my mom was, you know, the leader, my dad. But I mean, patriarchy was still there, of course, because my dad always had the last word. But my mom, you know, she was the one that, you know, basically ran the household. But she was the enforcer of patriarchy, right? She was the one setting up the double standards. She was the one telling me this is how it had to be done. So I still saw that, but it came from her primarily. Not to say that I didn't see it from my father, because he did have the last word. So if I wanted to do something, I would go ask my dad, because I knew that his was the final word. You know, I was like, I'm not even gonna deal with my mom, you know. But and then you know, the same thing we were talking about, like the abuse, like verbal and physical abuse. That was the same thing like at my home, because maybe my father felt powerless because she did dominate everything else, you know. So I think that that's where he took his power, was in giving the last word and, you know, doing that physical abuse. So my question is, what do you think as a society that we should do? Because it's not just, I feel like, I don't know if I'm so hopeless, but I feel like it's not just what we, you know, decolonize from our minds as women and men, but just the system in general, like an educational system, where our kids are at every single day, you know, 8 hours a day from the time that they're, you know, 3 or 4. These are systems that are being reinforced there. And I see that because I have, you know, my daughters at home, and I always think like, oh, you know, they're told me this is, my home is not patriarchal, my home is not sexist, but my kids have those notions, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm doing like so much to break these, you know, to break these systems, and specifically in my home, and I will hear them sometimes say things like, oh, you know, daddies are, you know, the, you know,
where you get it from? Yeah.
You know, like, am I not doing a good job? Am I not? I know that that's the outside influence. There's always external factors that factor into, you know.
Yeah.
No, my question is, what do you all think that?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think one thing you identified even in talking about it in your own family is, what do we do systemically? I think one thing is how can we shift the kind of decision-making structures, right? So we don't have this kind of situation where there's one person who has to sign off, has the final say, as you said, on everything. You know, that tends to steer towards patriarchy. People who embrace patriarchy tend to want a role like that within organizations, movements, whatever. So I think, infusing more democratic decision-making processes for sure. One of the things that groups like BLM and a lot of the other folks that have emerged in this moment have these kind of decentralized structures also. So there's, if you may have a national presence, but there's not one person at the top telling everybody what to do. This was kind of the King Ella Baker tension in the civil rights movement, right? Where King was this very, I don't want to call him authoritarian, but he was this lead decision maker. Everything went through him at SCLC. Ella Baker when she came into the organization, really objected to that, helped to steer the student movement in a different direction to some extent. So I think that's where beyond our organizations, that's what part of what we should be calling for in our movement, right? We want to reimagine decision-making structures, that the form of quote-unquote democracy that we have in the United States of representation also steers us in that direction. We get to vote one time, and usually some man goes and represents us, right? And I think if we need to, in addition to some of the stuff that Mark Heather was talking about around divesting and reinvesting, I think the other piece for the movement right now, a big focus is on community control. How do we really take back the decision making so that even if we're electing people, they know they got to come back and really check in on decisions with the community. But also, how do we just take some of that power away from them and create structures in our communities that give more of us an opportunity to engage, even when setting those up, like how are decisions made in those spaces, how our voices elevate in those spaces, so that they don't, again, just so we don't start recreating a system. Yeah, but it's a lot of work. Yeah.
Can I add to that? So I think being in the practice of these alternative models, right, and whatever way that looks like within your family, right, is always a counterbalance to whatever's happening on the outside, right? And I think it's important for us to hold that. I think I'm both scared and excited to be thinking about how I raise community together, and because of that question, right? Like, am I going to be successful, right? Am I going to be in raising a new generation that's actually going to click into something different? But I think what gives me hope is one of my youth who I met when he was 14. He was the young black man who was getting kicked out of school, kicked out of class, and was on that track. You know what I'm saying? And we started organizing on campus, started having these conversations around patriarchy and sexism and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying? And it was awesome. He got into his rhythm, and it was motivating. The movement motivated him. He graduated early, then got caught up, right? And now he's in Soledad prison, doing about 10 years, right? And that's terribly devastating to me because it feels like a loss. But what's the victory is he hits us up at the beginning and says, we're going to start a leadership development program inside. And what we're going to do is, and now what he's doing, they separate this thing into different units, and the first unit is patriarchy. That's the first, and I'm just like, dude, you are brilliant, man. Like, you know what I'm saying? And so,
we bring that to our school.
Yeah. So that to me,
all of the systems that we participate in, like religion and everything.
Yeah. And so that to me is what's humbling, what gives me hope. You know what I'm saying? In a space that is literally designed to reproduce patriarchy, he is having those conversations. It's drafting curriculum and is having folks come out and is sending them to us. And he's also a board member. So there's like, well, we can do this. Like, we can make this happen with these alternative structures, with these alternative practices, and being in it. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, that gives me hope too. And I often, like, I'm always looking for like social justice schools. I'm like, can I just send my kids to social justice? Where is the social justice school that I can just send them to? Because I feel like it's important in the systems that.
Yeah. So just real quick on this, I mean, being in the practice of self-reflection as an individual and as a collective is critical to this question you're asking, and sort of building that into the practices that you engage in within your family, within your among your peers, wherever you are, right? Whatever space you are, whether you're in prison, whether you're at a workplace, whether you're, a community-based organization, a church, wherever. I think having active dialogue around these questions is critical. Around education, the Brown Boy Project was doing some really innovative programming at a middle school in Oakland, where they basically were bringing gender justice curriculum to middle schools. I think the program was just recently stopped, but it was a really powerful 2 years of work that they did with youngsters at an age where they're just starting to come into their own and think about sexual orientation and gender, and really having more formed senses about these things. They were able to catch them at a really critical moment. And so I think, we have to address taboo and, eschew traditions and really be, I think, a little bit more innovative and cutting edge in terms of addressing these things and doing it in a really bold way. My colleague Rosa and I, we're really starting to do some of this. We're looking at domestic violence within the context of boys and men of color. What does it mean to address domestic violence from that perspective when boys and men are typically batterers, but these are questions we have to wrestle with, right? In terms of, trying to ensure our families are strong and our communities are filled with the opportunities and prosperity that we want, so, yeah.
I apologize for everybody we didn't get to, but we're bumping up against the end of the summit, so if we can give a round of applause.
remind everyone to fill out the evaluation